Invasion Audiobook, Part 17. On the back of the ATV, Jacob was sobbing, and his face ached from being backhanded, mainly due to his hesitancy to get on the ATV to be carried out of the hot zone to relative safety by the man who intended to pick him up, ostensibly to save his life, albeit having to snap him out of his moment of seemingly emotionally induced paralysis caused by him losing track of his family, assuming the worst had occurred in relation to the outcome they likely would have experienced, as he had lost track of them. The other stragglers, other ATV drivers who somehow couldn't keep up with the main group, had been at the right place and at the right time to assist those who fled the scene of the skirmish between the PAP troops and the guardsmen originally tasked with protecting and caring for the refugees. Joseph being one of a small group that was thus rescued by the other ATV piloting men, who themselves were a mix of other guardsmen mixed with a group of armed civilians, many of whom being former veterans of OIF or OEF, and in some cases, even both. This force had been they who, unbeknownst to the refugees and the guard forces tasked with their care, were the ones who had been targeted originally by the artillery barrage that had struck dangerously close to the camp of the refugees that had been moved deeper into that portion of the forest, further northwest of the city of Ann Arbor's outer suburbs. The rural terrain in the immediate vicinity was now the current objective of the Chinese PAP paramilitary forces of the two light armor brigades, as well as their one allied unit in the area, the KPA's Mechanized Infantry Brigade. They received artillery support from artillery units of the Chicom PLA regular army forces who fired from distant CCP regime-owned properties in a circle around Ann Arbor, arrayed off a dozen or so miles from the city itself, beset on all sides for the ability to provide support to the units of the Ann Arbor AO, or Area of Operations, but also to other coalition forces operating further out from the city as well. Brother, I'm so sorry for hitting you, man, but you could have got us all killed back there. Had to snap you out of your shit, my man. I usually go by Tony P, but you could just call me Tony. We cool? Tony asked Jacob after explaining himself as well as making an acquaintance. Yeah, we cool, replied Jacob, with tears still flowing from his eyes. The wind from the open-air ride on the ATV didn't help his watering-up condition, but he began to just then come to grips with what had actually just occurred. Although he hadn't come to terms yet, though, so to speak. He remained quiet and deep in thought for the rest of the duration of the ride, saying nothing as they turned onto various different hunting trails, being careful to stay under the cover of the forest, as many had been hit by various air-to-ground munitions from armed drones earlier, as was yelled by Tony after a moment of awkward silence between both men, as he kept pace with the other ATVs. We lost lots of good people, just trying to defend themselves from this shit. Whatever this even is. I thought America was invincible, but these little bastards got us by the balls already. Had no idea China would ong-bak our asses like this, mused Tony, upon having explained the drone strikes that occurred on some of the other ATV drivers who dared to wander beyond the relative security offered by the canopy of the forest. Although it was only temporary, being that it was early October and the leaves had begun changing colors and also began to fall little by little. However, fortunately, there were still plenty of pines and similar coniferous trees that could offer IR camouflage from the planes and drones from above. From artillery to drone strikes to assaulting light tank and mechanized infantry forces, the group of urban defenders Tony had wound up with had been beaten to a pulp. Tony was a veteran of Desert Storm and had been in the Marines when he had been deployed. But he was much older now than then, being in his 50s. But he had somewhat of a youthful appearance, having aged fairly well, and appeared to look more like he was in his late 30s than early 50s. He handled his rifle well, a standard AR-15 model, and he had on him still a decent amount of ammo. In pouches on his own plate carrier that he of course had purchased for himself at some point. No head protection though, merely a simple boonie cap with a brim all the way around. He looked professional, almost like a merc in some ways. Tony then a bit later in the drive explained that they had fled in haste from the city just before the encirclement of it had occurred, and that he and the others had literally found these ATVs at a warehouse, which had still fuel in the gas tanks and also some spare fuel tanks that were full of precious fuel for the vehicles. Thus, they had taken them and used their vehicles to great effect with hit-and-run style assaults, even acquiring weapons from deceased Chinese and North Korean forces before said forces could even retrieve the dead or their weapons or their equipment. These small scores of valuable gear were quite helpful, as one man acquired a Chinese-made Type 69 RPG with an assault pack carrying 3 spare rockets, 2 of which were anti-tank, and then there was one that was an HE fragmentation, or also called an anti-personnel style rocket. They had knocked out 2 North Korean armor personnel carriers with these rockets, causing them to then call in their artillery support on the American bivouac area that was out in the forest just many hours earlier. By that point in the second day, that was the strike that had dislodged Jacob's group as well. But the group Tony was with that had been targeted was several hundred men in size originally, with even a small handful of women, mostly also ex-armed forces, who were willing to help the defense and in any conceivable way that they could, just like the men that were already involved. The group was largely KIA'd in the ensuing artillery strikes, fully unaware that a drone with IR cameras had detected their positions through a patchy area of canopy above the forest and sent their coordinates to the artillery's FDC, or Fire Direction Control, as well as to the battlefield intelligence sections and the headquarters battalions of the local invading forces. The vicious barrage had eliminated a few hundred off the muscle, leaving a much diminished force of barely over 100 to flee, scattering in multiple directions, with some intercepted by both PAP and KPA units closing in to encircle their position upon the cessation of the artillery barrage. However, fortunately, most of the remaining elements managed to flee in time to avoid such a perilous outcome. However, the drone spotted Jacob's group and assumed that they were part of the forces that had fled the area of the barrage, of which Tony was a part. This led to the skirmish in the woods, whereby the fleeing other Americans on their ATVs ran into the two companies of invading forces that were annihilating the group that Jacob was with, of the refugees and their protection forces, nearly wiping them all out, save a few dozen or so overall. All over the map, as Chinese and North Korean forces spread out beyond the city to clear the local rural countryside, American forces were being scattered in many directions, causing situations such as what had occurred with the two groups of Americans encountering one another, as well as the pursuing People's Armed Police troops trying to hunt them down. For Jacob and a small group of others, it had been a blessing that it actually saved their lives. However, for June and her and Jacob's three youngsters, it was far too late. However, Jacob, for the time being, had no knowledge or even way to know exactly what happened to his family, but he was on a roller coaster in terms of his mental state. Grief would then shift into anger, which would then shift into a rage. It would awaken something within him, something that he never even knew or fathomed could even be there. He was about to undergo some major life changes that would forever remake the man that he was. As his old mundane life and existence in general as a simple hardware store manager was about to change into that of a warrior. Quite a drastic alteration, indeed. For the time being, he, Tony, and the other ATV drivers and the others that had been rescued from Jacob's original group as well, now pulled into the new camp location of the group that had scattered on their ATVs, as this group now had learned a tough, harsh lesson. The only chance to survive was to live a nomadic sort of existence, and one where living conditions were to be conducted with the utmost stealth and secrecy involved, whereby camouflage was to be the order of the day, all day and every day, and movement was to become a regular facet of life in concurrence to the life of stealth and solitude, as well as earthen homes in the form of digging in, was also a staple in this form of life. Where the 4 and 3 wheelers and even some gators pulled into was an area where men had been digging and hacking down pine branches by which to camouflage their vehicles with. The men already there had been already digging for many hours, it seemed like. At least 3 or 4, perhaps. There already were formidable-looking foxholes and small trenches that connected to very few small, primitive, bunker-like complexes, dug out into a small, sandy, soiled hill within this stretch of forest. The soil was mostly a sandy type of composition, not only here, but in many parts of the state, mixed with different rocks at times, but the soil itself favored digging operations due to its ability to be removed easily via shovel, and thus made creating earthen structures fairly simple when compared to other regions throughout the overall land. By now, on late afternoon on day 2 of the invasion, the war was still going strong, with massive regions and cities already had been captured before even the first day had come to an end. But there were still many areas still making an effort to hold out, despite it seeming futile by this point. By day 2, most of Michigan had succumbed, although pockets created throughout the state and even in other parts of the nation, continued the struggle. Even though they were getting smaller and smaller, the cap of the land hadn't yet been taken completely, although a massive urban battle raged there. Although the rest of the land, though, literally had no idea about it, as no grid or mass communications were even working. Although many would have been indifferent about it, as there wasn't much love for the regime amongst the regular people. But nevertheless, even that area was still within the nation's borders, and was merely another place trying to hold out. Despite the dogged resistance occurring in many places, people understood that the war realistically was lost after the first day, as as it as the truth struck people that without communications, coordination, and organization, and professional, well-equipped, ready, and well-trained forces in big enough sizes, there realistically wasn't anything that could be done to stem the tides. Regardless, though, it continued as no other realistic options presented themselves besides fighting and perishing or surrender. And many didn't want to even risk accepting the latter. It was inconceivable to willingly give in to a despotic totalitarian state who had no qualms about carrying out inhumane edicts for brutal treatments and slavery in general, as well as genocidal organ harvesting, a facet of the brutal secular humanist CCP's income operations, a very dark undertaking indeed. Many did, though, surrender, even though they knew damn well the consequences involved in so doing. They mostly did so because they got trapped in situations whereby they ran out of things or simply got surprised into surrendering, or otherwise wanted to try to take their chances in hopes that there might be ways to somehow make it through captivity. Because while the CCP was conducting a war of extermination and slavery, they did take millions of slaves alive for forced labor purposes, something most of those captured hoped that they had a chance to survive somehow, and maybe even be emancipated post-war at some later point, and maybe even repatriated back to some place where they'd somehow be free again, even if it wasn't repatriation back to their own land. They hoped, of all hopes, that there'd be a redeeming grace that would help them survive this hellish experience. For Jacob, he was shown around the site where he and the others picked up survivors of his refugee group where they would be staying amid the other group. Tony asked Jacob why he had no firearm. Jacob, ashamed, told him that he never owned one, to which Tony gave Jacob a captured Chinese QBZ-95 assault rifle and gave him a crash course once over on how to use it. Rifles weren't especially hard to use once Jacob was shown the charging handle and magazine weld and the other features of the switch between safety, semi-auto, and full auto. Tony told Jacob to always walk around with safety on when in the camp, unless in a combat situation. Jacob then was given several of some of the captured magazines full of the 5.8 by 42 millimeter Chicom ammo, and then was given some Chicom body armor, also taken off a deceased Chicom soldier the day prior during the battle that had ensued within the city, which Tony's group had managed to escape just prior to its encirclement, mostly via underground routes beneath the closing cordon of the battle lines above ground in the city. Just prior to that, his group had been engaged in holding rubbled positions and using basements and sewers and maintenance tunnels beneath the city to move from position to position throughout Ann Arbor, popping up to conduct quick ambushes, only then to disappear once again and move on to the next location, leaving prior to artillery or airstrikes being called in on their last known positions, or evading a straight-up infantry dismount hunter-killer team looking for hiding Americans in rubbled, gutted structures and husks that were former buildings. Tony said that his closest call the day prior was when PAP light tanks lobbed shells into one of the buildings that he had come up from the basement of to carry out a quick ambush on the light tank turret gunners, only then to have them abruptly turn their turrets towards the building just as he bolted into the basement, hitting the door that connected it to a maintenance tunnel, literally a second before the shells blasted the husk into dust, with the blasts actually ripping the floor open and collapsing in the rubble from the walls that had just still been standing just moments earlier when he went up there to take shots at the gunners. This reminded him of his own mortality, and that taking risks like that was just a step too far in terms of risking his life. After all, the attrition rate had been savagely brutal upon the Americans when in comparison to the Sino-Korean troops in the city, and hundreds of Americans dying for each one of theirs KIA'd, with maybe perhaps 15 wounded to go along per KIA on the invader side. It was truly horrible, and only in very rare instances did the Americans manage to do any real effective damage where they proved a formidable enough force in the wake of having no communications, no coordination, no real organization, no command and control either, beyond what little ad hoc forces they'd actually managed to scrape together. In spite of such overwhelming odds, the Americans did the very best they could with what they had, all things considered. And Molotovs and tiny amounts of stolen Chicom and North Korean weaponry, with very small quantities of AT-4s, at least did make enough of an impact to where the invaders knew that it wouldn't be a complete cakewalk, meaning that they would at least have some men lost, and as well as machines also here and there. Because even in any decisive victory, there's of course still going to be some losses on the winner's side, even if negligible in the total grand scheme of things. Although, to the units who sustained these losses of any type, it proved to be a major deal, at least to them personally. This angered and caused harsh reprisals at times on captured Americans as predisposed sociopathic PAP forces relished in their diabolical deeds of their favorite atrocities, many of which were top-down creations of the officers themselves of each unit. Not official on any orders or paperwork, but more passed down as a sort of twisted word-of-mouth sort of proliferation of means and methods. Tony spent 2 hours teaching Jacob how to dry fire and aim properly his new defensive tool, his QBZ-95 bullpup-designed rifle. With the mag weld and action in the buttstock of the rifle itself and charging handle on the top of the rifle between the handrail and the stock itself. Tony also had Jacob practice chambering and unchambering rounds and loading and unloading mags themselves into and out of the rifle, as well as showing him how to hand load the ammo itself into the mags so that he would be able to load his own in the future. Jacob became a fast learner, as again, the basic mechanics of the rifle operation weren't anything overtly complicated to learn, as he paid close attention to Tony's instruction. Jacob began to feel more like a real man, and less like a total cuckold like before. Tony had empowered Jacob by giving him something he didn't possess before, the means by which to assert himself and defend himself, something which made Jacob feel authentic and gave him a sense of more control over his own God-given free will, to where he felt less dependent upon others now for services such as protection. He would truly become something that God had ordained him to be. Jacob was about to discover who he truly was meant to be, as the bland nature of his old life was shed away like dead skin, and in place of it, a new life, one of that of a warrior. However, this was only the beginning, and Jacob had a ways to go, so to speak, before that would truly dawn on him. After all, a firearm itself isn't enough. He would need to learn how to properly use it, just like any other tool of any other trade. Yes, indeed, Jacob would need to learn small unit battle tactics and become proficient in these skills to become who he needed to be, and then gain the raw experience to prove himself in his new life. Jacob seen a group practicing battle drills with small tactical formations. As Tony went into one of the small bunkers to go to sleep, he had suggested to Jacob that he go and practice with the others of the group and join in with them, pointing at them, before ducking his head upon jumping down into the trench and going into the doorway of the earthen bunker of chopped trees for beams by which to support the weight of the earth carved out to make the primitive complex. As Jacob looked at the group, he began to proceed over to them to join in. Just then, Tony popped his head out of the entryway of the bunker quickly, then tossing two items at Jacob: an MRE and a bottled water. He yelled at him to eat, and then he dipped back into the bunker to rest. Jacob was grateful for everything and thanked God for his survival thus far, although pleading with God to protect his wife and son and two daughters if they were still somehow even alive. He then ate quickly and drank his water, and then he joined in with the others to practice basic tactics upon introducing himself and then being permitted to join in on the vital training. He would need every bit of it soon, as he began to feel a sense of anger toward the enemy. But that anger began to turn to rage that would soon become a sense of fury on the battlefield. As the invasion continued, it was almost evening on day 2. As he trained and thought of his family, who did happen to be alive, although he wasn't aware, Jacob had no idea what had happened, but as he prepared himself to join the fight against the invaders had his family. The refugees and guardsmen that survived and were earlier captured had been placed upon the tanks in the case of the wounded, who would then be taken for medical treatment, as they'd been wounded in battle and captured in that state, not willingly, having had tossed down their arms as common cowards, something that even the PAP respected, as the Chinese warrior culture afforded much more humane treatment to such POWs. They were carried out on the backs of the light tanks, the Type 62Gs used in the skirmish. June, her son and two daughters, and some of the other refugees had been zip-tied and had rope woven between all their zip-tied arms to keep them in a single file line, and had the rope tied to the back of one of the Type 62Gs, which had then pulled them, even when some of them had stumbled and fallen from all the exhaustion of all they'd been through. No mercy was shown. The tanks continued pulling them. Upon having made it back to the road where the headquarters platoons of each of the two companies used in the pursuit and skirmish, both the Light Tank Company and the Mechanized Infantry Grenadier Company with them, had ended up loading them into the Shangji logistical covered trucks of the two headquarters platoons under guard, and then took them back to the temporary prisoner transit camp created for the masses of captured enemy civilians and fighting men of the armed forces, and any alphabet paramilitary elements, or even merely armed civilians who fought the foreign invaders. This prison complex was hastily constructed on day one at the Ann Arbor Municipal Airport, now turned FOB, and transit camp, by forces of the National Construction Corps of China, essentially a large paramilitary version of what the regular military's combat or civil engineers would be, including armed and combat trained and capable. This location was just off of I-94 at the southern end of the city itself. When the external forces had invaded in from Canada to support the Trojan shock units deeper inland, one of the tag-along units with the southwestbound prong of externals coming down from the Ontario funnel with the 10 group armies and some other allied units was an element of the National Construction Corps who traveled and dispersed to rapidly construct hasty prisons and FOBs in support of local combat units doing roundups and clearing operations, in addition to standard capture of POWs and typical combat operations leading to ensuing battles such as the initial one taking place within the city itself happening on day one. By early day two, they'd proceeded onward to assist in Lansing, where a larger battle was wrapping up by earlier in the morning on day two to capture that particular city. Though not being utilized in direct combat there, they were used as a support element to temporarily guard and expand the makeshift prisons in that sector, along with Trojans there already having been tasked out for that mission as well. They'd been pleased that the work in Ann Arbor had been completed within 24 hours, because it made things in Lansing run much smoother upon receiving their help so rapidly as well. In Ann Arbor, June and the other captured EPWs, or enemy prisoners of war, were being received in this new facility. As the Shangji trucks crossed through the barriers and then through the gate, showing their PAP paramilitary ID cards to gain entry. It was late afternoon by this point in time, going into the evening. They'd be dropped off to be processed at the processing center. June and her son and two daughters had black bags placed over their heads, along with the others in the trucks, so as not to see where they were going. However, upon the trucks reaching a slow pace and gravel now beginning to crackle beneath the tires of the truck, all the recently captured began to realize that they were nearing their destination and would be in for it, so to speak. They could hear the dogs barking amid Mandarin yelling as the truck entered the huge compound of the transit prison camp. Things were already hellish, as June had feared the worst upon their arrival, not yet seeing her surroundings as of yet. Soon the truck came to a squeaky, slow halt, with the engine being shut off. Mandarin yelling was heard upon two doors slamming, to which the several PAP troops guarding the prisoners in the back stood them all up, mumbling in Mandarin to one another. The guards in the back led them to the gate of the back of the truck, as it was unlatched and dropped by the driver and TC, or truck commander, both of which helped the guards in the back to assist each prisoner to step safely down the tiny ladder on the dropped back truck gate, as they were blindfolded and couldn't see where they actually had to step. June was next, as two guards in the truck grabbed beneath each of her zip-tied arms and escorted her to the edge of the truck. She was naturally horrified and sweating profusely and breathing heavily. Part of her wondered if she was going to die or perhaps be abused in some sort of horrific way. She was a beautiful, shapely woman with curves and light brown skin. The Chinese troops had been talking and laughing about her, all in Mandarin, throughout the trip to the prison camp, unbeknownst to June, and of course, that soldiers could be nasty in sexual ways. Of course, a beautiful woman such as her seemed to be a turn-on for these young Chicoms. As she was helped down the ladder gently, and then she was plopped slightly onto the graveled ground, and then escorted by two guards that came out from one of the old airport buildings turned processing center and led her inside with the others. The door shut upon all the prisoners being brought indoors, whereby transfer paperwork was signed between the capturing PAP troops of the unit turning in the prisoners, with the receiving unit staffing the massive prison complex. Minutes went by where they stood there zip-tied, still with their hoods on. Finally, it happened. The hoods came off, and the zip ties were cut by a group of PAP guards in all black body armor and black and gray camouflaged PAP uniforms. The PAP had several uniform types. In this particular environment, they wore their night assault camouflage, and the gear of this group within this building carried were all non-lethals. The perimeter guards, tower guards, and the QRF, or Quick Response Force, were the only forces permitted to carry their standard lethal weapons, as those working with detainees and inmate POWs up close carried non-lethals in order that, in any escape attempt, no prisoner could overpower guards to take lethal weapons to aid in any active escape attempts. The non-lethals were plenty imposing still, however, and consisted of nightsticks or batons, cattle prods, and CS gas grenades, and every 1 man per 10-man squad did carry a shotgun, albeit with only non-lethal rubber pellet ammo, and only for riot suppression should that even occur amongst the inmates. However, the melee weapons were plenty intimidating enough. June looked around and instantly noticed an over-the-top level of CCP propaganda, a mix of posters and a large framed photograph of Xi Jinping looking down at everyone from above the desk of the lieutenant in charge of the intake area. June recognized Xi from older TV news stations covering international affairs, as China was often center stage as the new world leader in this bleak new world where despotism was on the rise, with China as the new world hegemon. Freedom was forever crushed, and now it seemed the grounds of freedom would be salted for it to never rise again. This transit prison camp was where newly captured POWs would forever kiss goodbye their personal freedom for the rest of their lives, as their new lives would be an existence of slavery, bondage, or genocide, all incumbent upon their status and rating by a committee of Chicom bureaucrats and AI programs doing the sorting to make the processing run vastly smoother. But other things occurred in this facility as well, ranging from interrogations and intelligence gathering to torture to even sexual slavery for women in the bordello for the PAP troops that were in that part of the prison camp that connected to the PAP FOB side of the entire campus. The lieutenant, sitting at his desk, addressed the American detainees, who had just been freshly arrived into his clutches. They all stood there with a squad of guards flanking about 17 total detainees. "You are all now prisoners of the CCP. You will speak only when spoken to and addressed. You will answer all questions addressed to you. No talking is permitted, or we will assume you are plotting an active escape attempt. Do you understand? Nod for yes if you do." Fearing some sort of harsh response by the guards flanking them or from the lieutenant himself, all the American detainees nodded that they understood the terms. "Good! You will go with my guards, and you will do everything you are told. You will all be processed and categorized and cataloged and segregated and locked up according to your given status. And your final destination will be determined by our AI system, which will determine where you will be sent for your final prison home. Welcome to your new life, where you lazy imperialists will learn a hard day's work and how to meet quota, and American women will learn how to please our fighting men." The lieutenant snapped calmly, albeit with an angry, resolute tone, as he gazed at June and a few of the other women in the group. June loved her son and daughters, and out of instinct as a mother, tried to plead for their safety and her ability to stay with them, to which she was shocked with a cattle prod, falling down, writhing in pain. Her body ached and tingled all over. "No talking!" yelled the PAP lieutenant, before telling the guard who shocked June to pick her up to her feet, giving the command in Mandarin to the guard. June was dazed and could barely stand. The lieutenant continued, "You will obey, and you will begin your processing now. We to the girl slaves will shave your heads, and you will be sanitized and delouseified, then given your new inmate uniforms." Upon finishing that, he told the guards to take them away in Mandarin commands. The guards then escorted the group down the hallway before leading them off into a modular room that was connected to the airport building they had arrived in by having a section of wall knocked out to connect the modular structure to it. The group was brought in and separated by male and female, military and civilian, combatant civilian, and non-combatant civilian. Upon this occurring, a PAP sergeant at the desk filled out paperwork and input data into a computer, as the military systems and other intranet systems of Chinese military and paramilitary elements functioned off of the generators powering the massive complex, making these systems able to function, as well as portable and building lighting that was hooked up to these very same generators. The only places in the whole land with any sort of power or communications were the Sino-Russian coalition ran facilities, and basically anything outside of the non-functional grid ran off of generator power. This was an island of lighting in a sea of darkness that lacked electricity. The AI system would categorize and sort the inmates as their photos and fingerprints were logged into the computer at the desk, with the finger and iris scanning technologies to log and assign all detainees a number and score for their destination from the transit camp. As this was a processing and waiting and intelligence center primarily, June, still in pain from the shock, as well as still recovering from being dazed, was seeing her son and daughters for the last time, as this room was the last place they'd even ever see each other again, and couldn't even say goodbye, much less embrace each other one last time. They locked eyes, and June wept as they were removed to be shaved and deloused before being given uniforms and assigned a cell block for housing. June had her biometrics taken and sat down on the wood slab bench in the room, before then finally being escorted into a room whereby there were we to the Gers in there. Flown in on day one from China to work as slave laborers in the Laogais and POW centers and transit camps. They helped the Americans to strip off their clothes, and they themselves looked like depleted, depressed, lanky figures, having endured a life of soft kill enslavement at the hands of their cruel masters, forcing them to be robbed of all joy within their lives as the forever slaves of the CCP regime. The women covered their nakedness with their arms and hands, but to no avail. The PAP guards grinned and made catcalls in Mandarin, all the while maintaining their serious, all-business body language, ready at a moment's notice to stomp their heads into the concrete if necessary. The men came in after them, the women, 2 guardsmen that weren't wounded, thus being given the standard treatment, and also a few refugee men and 1 combatant civilian who'd been captured. The women were deloused and showered quickly, moved through like cattle or products in an assembly line. Fresh meat. They were tossed bland light blue prison scrubs with no underwear. Then they were all put in leg shackles and a chain belt with handcuffs connected so that they could be escorted chained down the hallway as a single chain gang of women. The same would occur with the men behind them as they were next in the overall procession of processing. The guards received word over their radios from the desk non-commissioned officer who was in the processing room on where to take them. The hall was more portable building, mostly concrete modular pieces likely driven in from Canada by truck in massive quantities to be able to make this facility. Doors aligned the hallway, mostly on the right-hand side, which led to temporary holding cell blocks to hold the new inmates until more semi-permanent housing would be assigned according to the AI program scoring on the PAP categorizing systems. There were massive fenced-in areas outdoors with chicken coop-looking structures for the prisoner housing areas for the longer-term housing, as well as an area which was the bordello for whichever women were to be kept as sex servitude on site, where accommodations consisted of being locked in a wooden dog box with air holes drilled into it and a slot for food bowls and water bottles being brought out to be used in makeshift wooden rooms with mattresses in them for 1 hour usage by paying troops. Typically, it was other PAP or occasionally some KPA troops who could afford it from the area's fob next door that came to relieve their stress, so to speak. It was a brutal, hellish place, and this was only the beginning. Fortunately for June, she was escorted to a metal door in the hallway that one of the PAP guards slid their ID through to open it, causing it to slide open slowly, whereby the guards led the women in, 2 guards in front, 3 behind them. The rest of the 10-man guard squad, the other 5, must have left to attend to other duties, as they were no longer there and had peeled off. The short hallway they entered was an enclosed cell block of modular prison cells connected to the modular hallway, which connected to the main modular hallway. They were told in broken English to walk only on the red line in front of the cell doors, then to stop and turn to face their cells. One guard walked by to unshackle each woman, as the other 4 stood by in case needed. Then the doors were opened all at the same time, and the women were told to "Go in now!" as the guard who unshackled them had yelled this at them. They entered their tiny concrete boxes, portable cells only 7 feet high and 7 by 8 foot length and width. There was a steel toilet sink combo in the cell with no toilet paper and a long concrete slab that ran the short length of the cell. Already, as the door shut, June turned around in sheer horror. To her, it all had set in. It was all over. Life was over. The sheer trauma already endured. And this was by far the worst of all of it. Her husband was gone, so was her son and daughters. Gone, all gone. She suddenly was flush with despair and cried to the point of wailing. In fact, all the women in the cell block were doing the same. No guards were any longer in the hall, as they all left and shut the heavy door connecting the short cell block hall to the main hall, leaving them in there as if to rot, like they were simply items being stored or warehoused. They were now CCP property, human chattel of Xi and his godless regime, where Xi and the CCP were the little g god. They belonged to him now, in all but their souls. They all wailed until sometime later when the door opened in the evening. It was perhaps likely 2 hours later, so it was probably 7 p.m. or thereabouts. No way to tell time in this evil place of suffering. There was a cart rolled by, pushed by a trustee wee to the gur inmate, slave laborer for the facility. He slid open a small food slot at the bottom of the door, sliding in bowls with rice, 2 pieces of broccoli, and 1 chicken leg apiece. It wasn't very much food, but they wouldn't starve. But they were left wanting, as it was about half of what an average adult could eat for a dinner meal. They wolfed down their food, wishing they had a little more, although it was barely at least enough to where it sufficed. They slid their bowls out as they were then collected 15 minutes later, with the guard and trustee leaving again. The women returned to crying, with June laying on her concrete slab bed, no pillow, no blanket. It wasn't freezing, but it wasn't warm either. The room temp made her withdraw her arms into the scrubs for warmth, finally falling asleep. She woke up to the food slot opening again. This time, it was noodles that were slid in with onion slices and tiny pieces of cubed pork. Again, not a very lot of food, but it was enough to at least where they wouldn't starve. She had been asleep a very long time. She had actually cried herself to sleep and slept long due to the crash from barely sleeping for nearly 2 whole days. It was perhaps morning when she woke up, although she wasn't entirely sure. Soon, she would be getting extracted from her cell to visit the MSS, who maintained an office for interrogations within the prison's temporary holding area of where she was now currently locked down. End of part 17.